Ever since its creation, Transformers has always been at the forefront of the toy market. Like G.I. Joe, He-Man, and other similar franchises of the 1980s, Transformers was a toy line promoted by a cartoon. And like many other companies, Hasbro had simply bought the designs from a Japanese company. In this case, Takara's Diaclone and Microman line of toys. However, unlike many other franchises at the time, Transformers had a bit more depth and interest. I mean, right off the bat, it was 2 toys in one. The concept of a race of alien robots who could transform into vehicles was very cheesy, but slowly morphed into a fairly neat science fiction concept. The original cartoon, and especially the movie, provided a ton of neat science fiction visuals and storytelling that got many kids hooked. As silly and childish as it was, I still enjoy the trippy visuals of the film. Fast forward to a couple decades later, and one could argue that its hype had died down. With countless spin-offs, comics, and video games, it started to get a little stale. Of course, right when the movie came out, interest in the series was reinvigorated, although I believe mostly to be out of spite. The criticisms against the movies are so used up at this point that I don't even have the energy to do so I won't. I mean, like, seriously, there are people on the internet who still rant about this stuff, like its recent headline news. Just move on to something else. But to give credit where it's due, the movie was a necessary dose of morphine to keep the franchise going even further. And considering how much money and eyes they collect, it's safe to say that Hasbro won't kill off their license anytime soon. It also added a lot of great talent to the brand, with plenty of good comics, shows, lore, and even video games adding on to the Transformers mythology. But still, it couldn't shake off its reputation as a glorified advertisement, and this was especially apparent in the video games. Unlike the other mediums in which Transformers were receiving a lot more love and attention, the video games were, in Hasbro's eyes, solely there to advertise their current iteration. Whether it be movie tie-ins or cheaply made video games to capitalize on a running TV show, the quality of these games suffered heavily. So when it comes to video games, the Transformers series is a very mixed bag, often argued for leaning closer towards bad, and is not too hard to see why. Unlike other IPs and franchises who exist in large pools of lore and storytelling, Transformers exists mostly in a vacuum of separated continuities and universes, all of which exist for the exclusive purpose of selling more toys and products. And oftentimes, this has worked. People bought the toys, they enjoyed the brief stories that were made, and they moved on. High Moon Studios was no stranger to this style of soulless game development. Despite starting off with Darkwatch, a decently loved console FPS in 2005, the company shifted very quickly, and in 2008 they had to release a video game based on Jason Bourne, being universally declared as average. It was clear that High Moon had a hunger for creativity, and through the use of a large IP, wanted to expand upon a beloved franchise and take the IP back to its roots. Transformers War for Cybertron was going to be that masterpiece. High Moon Studios came up with the idea of a pseudo-prequel set entirely on Cybertron during the Autobot-Decepticon Civil War. After pitching the concept to Hasbro and Activision, both companies decided to give it a shot, and through a surprising amount of creative freedom, High Moon made their mature story. Released in June of 2010, Transformers War for Cybertron is a third-person shooter made as a sort of prequel to the Transformers universe. While the game is canon in its own continuity, it remains fairly open to the Generation 1 timeline, which is what the developers were hoping for. Unlike most other Transformers games, however, War for Cybertron had 2 distinct features. First, it took place on Cybertron. As an outsider mostly looking in, I find it odd how long it took until a video game based around Cybertron was made. All other games are usually set on Earth, mostly in bland and dull-looking environments. However, the devs here went all out in making a unique but surprisingly realistic portrayal of Cybertron. It's clear that they put a lot of thought into the simple world design. Second, it would be a lot more mature. It took the source material very seriously, and while it did have some space for fun, silly moments, it kept the story from straying into cartoony goofiness. On top of that, it was a third-person shooter with its own setting and plot. Up until this point, nearly all of the Transformers games had been made exclusively to cash in on the current series or show at the time. Because of that, they seemed to lack any real quality or character, but this game would premiere in its own universe, although it wouldn't be the only entry. So with that, let's jump into the story. This game takes place right near the end of the war on Cybertron, with the Autobots losing a desperate battle against the Decepticons, led by Megatron. He is determined to gain control of Dark Energon, a volatile and dangerous substance that has the ability to corrupt and control Cybertronian life. Meanwhile, the Autobots are struggling to simply survive the war, with their numbers and resources dwindling. The story is split into 2 sections in chronological order, with the Decepticon half taking place first and the Autobot half taking place last. The story is pretty straightforward, but if you don't really want spoilers, then skip here. The game opens with Megatron attacking an orbital research station, defended by Autobot Sky Commander Starscream, hoping to learn more about the legends of Dark Energon. After seizing the station, Starscream switches sides. Gee, who could have seen that one coming? And he and his two brothers head down to some Energon bridge to make more of this stuff. Megatron, with the plan of infecting the core of Cybertron with Dark Energon, decides to attack the Autobot city of Iacon. Jesus, why do so many of the names end with O-N? He wants to obtain the Omega Key, which is what will allow him to enter the core in the first place. He learns, however, that the key is attached to Zeta Prime, and after defeating him, Zeta reveals that he doesn't actually have the key, and he's actually unlocked the real true key, Omega Supreme. Yeah, remember this guy from the cartoon? Omega Supreme hunts down Megatron, and after a lengthy battle, he gets corrupted by Dark Energon. With the core unlocked, Megatron begins his plans of infecting Cybertron itself. Meanwhile, the Autobots learn of Zeta Prime's death. Optimus takes temporary leadership and finally helps fend off the Decepticons from the city of Iacon. They have a brief scuffle with Starscream before he flies away. With the city now secure, they receive a distress call from Zeta Prime, who appears to be alive but is located within a prison in Kaon, a Decepticon city. Optimus, Bumblebee, and Sideswipe allow themselves to get captured, only to break out the rest of their Autobot brethren. They have a fight with Soundwave, who fatally wounds Zeta right before he escapes. Optimus returns to Iacon and the High Council declares him as a new Prime. He, along with Ironhide and Warpath, head down into Cybertron's core to help rescue Omega Supreme. With Ratchet's help, they free him from Dark Energon, but they realize that the core itself is beyond repair, as it is too corrupted with Dark Energon. The core itself is sentient, and it speaks to the Autobots, and it tells Prime that in order to save itself, the planet must go dormant for millions of years, during which Cybertron won't be able to sustain life. It then gives Optimus a piece of its spark. So long as it survives, so shall the core of Cybertron. This is the matrix of leadership. The Autobots begin a full-scale evacuation of the planet, only to be blockaded by an orbital weapons platform. Silverbolt, Air Raid, and Jetfire fly up into Cybertron's orbit in order to stop the station, only to realize that it was altered by the Dark Energon and turned into a living Cybertronian, Trypticon. A nice callback to the cartoons. After destroying his conversion cog and knocking him out of orbit, Trypticon impacts at Iacon City, where he faces off against Optimus, Bumblebee, and Ironhide, and is defeated. The game ends on a bit of a cliffhanger, with the Autobots preparing an arc in order to save the rest of the Autobots from Cybertron. As simplistic as the story seems, it's surprisingly well written. It has a really nice flow to it, and it's paced very well. You get a real sense of escalation to the various developments and plot points. I actually found myself really invested in it, and it's pretty easy to see why. It's nicely structured, and it feels like a well-written, action-packed movie. Although, in my personal opinion, the Autobot half was the strongest. The stakes feel a lot higher, and the story just feels a lot more interesting. It had much more engaging characters, and also had a lot more interesting set pieces and scenarios, which I'll get into later. Tone-wise, War for Cybertron straddles a nice line between dark and mature and action-packed and cartoony. Sometimes this can be a little off-putting. You'll see characters getting executed in one level and Autobots riding giant slugs in another. Still, I was never bothered by this, and if anything, it kept me invested in the characters. You do need a little bit of humor and fun now and then, and War for Cybertron does provide it in nice doses. In terms of delivery, the voice actors are cartoonish but are very good. Peter Cullen returns as the famous character Optimus Prime, and like everything else he does, he gives it his all.
We need to get to the Decagon fast. Are the Iacon speedways still drivable?
From the sky, they look barely usable, and you can try. Good luck, Optimus. With Zeta Prime gone, we're all looking to you now.
I'll do my best. Autobots, roll out!
At this point, Peter's voice is so intertwined with the character that to cast a different voice actor would be as radical as making him no longer blue or red, or no longer transform into a truck. You just don't do it. The other standout voice actor is Fred Tatasciore, who voices Megatron, Omega Supreme, and even Trypticon. As silly as the voice acting can be at times, every actor does a great job with their characters. I will say that this game shows off the Cybertron Civil War very well, as was the game's intention. In all the Transformers cartoons and even movies, the conflict between the Autobots and Decepticons feels less like a grand battle and more like two small teams skirmishing. Here you really get a sense of just how large and overreaching the conflict is, a lot more through the Autobot campaign, hence why I think I enjoyed a lot. This is a full-blown war. On the surface, Cybertron is in near ruins, under eons of constant battling and fighting. Up in orbit, there are tons of ships and debris all hanging above the planet. You get to see a ton of soldiers too, not only fighting, but simply shooting the shit and waiting around. You can feel the tension in the air, and I love it. I'll get into the art style in a little bit. I do, however, want to explain this game and its continuity in relation to the rest of the series. Yes, this game premiered in its own universe, but that universe has a lot more entries in it than you would think. Time for some explaining. War for Cybertron is part of what's called the Aligned Continuity, which includes Fall of Cybertron, these couple of novels, and yes, the Transformers Prime TV show and their subsequent spin-offs. Here's a bit of history to get you up to speed. From 1984 up until around the early 2000s, there had been one mostly stable, albeit fucking complicated and unapproachable timeline, simply referred to these days as Generation 1. It includes the original cartoon, the film, Beast Wars, and all this other stuff you see here. Then, throughout the 2000s, a bunch of different timelines and universes popped up to account for multiple shows and continuities. From an outsider's perspective, this made the entire franchise look overly complex, something a simple toy brand doesn't exactly want. So Hasbro decided to go back to its roots and to create a single new universe for their creative vision of Transformers, in order to return to the simpler days of Generation 1. When High Moon pitched their idea of a third-person shooter set on Cybertron, it was simply the right timing. Hasbro was already looking for an excuse to set up their continuity, so in a pretty ballsy move, they decided to greenlight the project, with its ultimate goal being to set up this new universe. As plot and mythology began to be written out, a TV show entered production, destined to air the same year War for Cybertron would hit shelves. This is what became Transformers Prime. They initially released a novel while the game and show were still in development, and it essentially ties both products together from a story perspective. And while both were fairly successful, the universe did see its demise, oddly enough, by the main showrunners. Apparently they hated the rules and foundation that War for Cybertron and Fall of Cybertron had set up, and after Prime they completely ignored all of its continuity. So far another series has been announced, but no one's sure whether or not it's a true sequel or a reboot. So much for that aligned universe. So yeah, this game actually ties in somewhat with Transformers Prime. I remember watching a bit of the show when it first aired, although I lost interest very early on. I remember Clone Wars Season 3 was airing right around that same time, and all in all, it's still a much better show. Although, again, I'm not the guy to be reviewing animated shows, but I did notice how a lot of the canon does carry over into the show. Like Megatron's backstory, Optimus in the Matrix of Leadership, along with the mythos of Dark Energon. However, the art styles remain very divided. Whenever there's a flashback in the show, they use the show's art style and not that of the games, which makes sense. They don't want to confuse the viewers, because again, they're kids. Still, I find it interesting how intertwined the canon is. Hasbro has a hard job when it comes to maintaining continuity, and it's a shame that they lost any semblance of unity as the show went on. So back to the game, specifically the gameplay. That's right, I haven't even talked about the gameplay yet. War for Cybertron is a third-person shooter, but incorporates a lot of weird and different elements that make it stand out from other similar titles. Every level has 3 characters in which the player can choose which one to play. This also allows each level to be played fully co-op with 3 people. I used to play co-op with my friend back when this game came out, but today I'm not entirely sure the online co-op mode is working, given its current circumstances. Which is a shame too, because I remember co-op being a lot of fun. However, the single player is just as good. Right off the bat, this game nails its combat loop. First, there's no cover system, so unlike Gears of War style pop your head out and shoot for 5 seconds and duck back down, the game encourages movement. Not just to kill enemies, but to dodge attacks, collect ammo, and regain your non-regenerative health. You can only hold up to 2 weapons, and if you're playing as Megatron or Optimus, you'll only switch to one. Optimus Prime will always hold on to his machine gun, and Megatron will always hold on to his cannon. Initially, this is something that I thought I would hate. However, upon playing through the campaign, it really isn't that much of an issue. The weapons, while fairly limited, are very fun to use, with the exception of the plasma cannon, and each gun fills out its practical role. They just feel good. It's hard to explain. I think it's a combination of the visuals, sound effects, and the impact it has on enemies that really make these things feel awesome. So overall, I love the guns. On top of that, each character is able to transform into a vehicle, usually with varying controls and weapons. Each vehicle hovers above the ground while stationary, so you can strafe around and dodge attacks in combat. But when you boost, it turns back into the normal cars and trucks that we recognize. Just imagine the Batmobile in Arkham Knight and you'll get the idea. Add in varying abilities and equipment, and the combat reaches a perfect balance of simplicity and complexity. I've got no complaints, because it's great. The biggest aspect about the combat that I loved was how much it encouraged movement. Anyone who's watched my channel before will know how much I hate the standard repetitive stop and pop shooting of Call of Duty, Gears, and so on. There's nothing fun about hiding behind a barrier and waiting for your health to recharge, only to pop back out and take a cheap burst at a nearby enemy. Here, if you want to survive, you need to keep on moving. And this is what adds a lot of fun and replayability to the levels. Depending on what type of weapons you have, your role might vary astronomically. If you have an assault rifle and a 2-shot shotgun, then you'll need to be fighting right in the middle of the fray, blasting away enemies and slicing them up with your melee attack. Or if you've got a burst rifle with a rocket launcher, then you'll need to make sure to keep a safe distance from the battle, all the while moving to get behind tougher, larger enemies. And I want to briefly discuss the enemies, because I feel conflicted about them. On one hand, I really wish there was more variation and creativity in these designs. As you might imagine, a lot of the enemies will look identical, and while the models and color schemes are slightly changed for the Decepticon and Autobot campaign, it does little to make a difference. Imagine the variation you'd get between PlanetSide 2 factions, and that's every enemy in this game. Now this is a common staple amongst Transformers games, and unfortunately as of recent years, even in Transformers Prime itself. Although War for Cybertron at least has a better excuse for it, the rest of these games just needed a cheap way to add in a bunch of enemies to a level. But in War for Cybertron, the devs needed a way to show the entire scale of the war. In the show, just about every character is unique, with a few exceptions. I love that there's such a wide variation of different Autobots and Decepticons, and for good reason. They're trying to sell toys here, but this created the side effect of either faction feeling very small and limited. Like these were the only guys actually fighting the war itself. Again, it felt like a small skirmish. So High Moon needed a lot more characters and soldiers everywhere. More ships, more Transformers, more everything. Now to give credit where it's due, the drones here aren't all clones of each other. There's a bit of variation in their gameplay mechanics, although you will be in sections that contain a lot of the same cannon fodder. Personally, I'm glad that High Moon decided to spend time on making the bad guys actually fun to fight, while worrying about visual uniqueness later, because they're fun to fight. When I was younger, I did sometimes wonder how certain Transformers were unique and special, while others were just stock standard grunts. Like, were all these guys born the exact same without a choice? And if not, how does one choose to be their own class? Speaking of which, how do you become a tank? Before the war, Cybertron was a peaceful planet. No war, no conflict, none of that. So how do you become a tank? Is this stuff like augmentations where you get altered to fight for your specific role? I don't know, this is just confusing. One issue that I found is that the AI can be a little simplistic. Well, the enemy AI usually doesn't have this problem. It's a completely different story for your fucking teammates. As I said, this game had co-op in mind, and if you don't have a human-controlled partner, which considering how this game's online functionality is dead, is going to include everyone nowadays, then 2 NPCs take over. And man, are they fucking stupid. Sometimes they'll get stuck on level geometry, other times they'll just straight up refuse to progress forward through the level. Like, fuck this war, I'm staying here. And the game will have to resort to teleporting them back to your checkpoint. The AI in Gears of War were better than this. What happened? Aside from this, the game is surprisingly polished, albeit for one horrible inclusion that I'll bring up later. Overall, the single player is great, and offers a decent amount of replay value. As I said, every character feels different to play, and both campaigns have one level where you get to play as a flying Transformer. These are surprisingly enjoyable. The controls are alright, but they could definitely be better. Otherwise, the gameplay is fun and engaging. There's one section in the Decepticon campaign where you get to attack an Autobot ship before boarding it and destroying everyone inside. The gameplay is at its best when the levels open up and allow for this type of experience. Feels like a sandbox. On the topic of the levels, I was surprised when I revisited them and just how enjoyable they really were. Oftentimes, levels in third-person shooters aren't exactly the most creative, but in this, High Moon went all out. First, there's a surprising amount of verticality. One common trope of modern shooters tends to be flat levels with no change in depth. Flat rooms and corridors with some chest-high walls, and that's it. But in order to flesh out Cybertron, the levels here feel vast and huge, with long bottomless cliffs, towering skyscrapers, winding roads, and tons of platforms. It really makes Cybertron feel like a huge city planet, and not just a flat surface covered by buildings. It's kind of funny because that's what we normally see in the various TV shows. This really helps the art style as well. In terms of gameplay, every level has a good pace to it, and the developers are well aware on what makes a game fresh and exciting. Every level has just the right amount of time for you not to only learn how to use a new mechanic or a character, but to also have plenty of time to enjoy it. Just when it's becoming a little boring or repetitive, the level ends on a climactic note and it leads into the next one. But within the levels themselves, it's not just one entire repetitive action scene. They give plenty of quiet time just to take in the ambiance or the plot, and this really helps the story a lot. The standout level for me is in the Autobot campaign, where Optimus, Sideswipe, and Bumblebee are in a Decepticon prison in Kaon. You start off with no weapons and have to scavenge with what's available, but the entire level has this amazing oppressive atmosphere. You feel that the odds here are against you, but once you set the prisoners free, it shifts from short skirmishes to large battles, before you partake in a chase to find Zeta Prime. Again, there's a ton of variety in this single level, and it's consistent throughout the entire game, and it's really what allows you to keep on playing. Just one more level, just one more level. With talk about the levels, I really want to get into the art style, and in turn the graphics. War for Cybertron runs on the Unreal 3 engine, and all things considered, it looks decent, but not great. I don't know why, but High Moon seems to have this trend of having ugly looking games with muddy graphics, and War for Cybertron is no exception. There were a number of other games released on Unreal 3 that look a lot better and cleaner than this. Models are a bit low quality, and textures are pretty blurry. For whatever reason, this seems to be a staple of High Moon's games. The Unreal 3 engine has a bad reputation for being grimy and color muted, and unfortunately War for Cybertron is a prime example of why. but not as bad as others. While the color palette is very limited, the use of lighting and geometry really make these levels look nice and keeps it from falling into ugly territory. That being said, the muted color tones can look a little jarring, especially with all these crazy set pieces and designs. Now don't get me wrong, there are plenty of beautiful looking scenery and designs, just the entire game has this murky feeling to it. As I said earlier, War for Cybertron's biggest suit is Cybertron, and its art style is really where the graphics shine. In most depictions, Cybertron is usually dumbed down in order to save a budget. A lot of times it's just depicted as a flat metal surface with a couple of sci-fi-esque buildings scattered around, or a bunch of generic corridors and rooms. In this game, you really get a sense of the scope and scale of this entire giant planet. Even though we've already known it's one giant city, you've never really had a chance to just stop and marvel at its size and complexity, and it looks great. It's just fantastic to look at and makes me yearn for more Transformers games set on this fantastic looking world. But it would be a shame not to mention the Transformer designs themselves, and this is definitely where High Moon showed their talent for the IP. Apparently the story goes that their very first concept of the game, before any levels or stories or even the knowledge that it would be set on Cybertron, was a simple concept drawing of Bumblebee, and it created enough momentum to allow Hasbro and Activision to greenlight the project. The designs of the characters are fantastic, and they find the perfect middle ground of taking the Generation 1 art style and bringing it into a contemporary setting, and they did a fantastic job. The designs aren't overly simplistic, nor are they too chaotic and distracting. On top of that, they take the very best visual elements of that character throughout their various incarnations, and they blend it together perfectly. I think Megatron's redesign is a perfect example, which has to be my absolute favorite design in the whole game. First, his profile is spot on with the original show, brought to a modern setting. He's got that same weird helmet piece around his head and a giant cannon attached to his arm. Then he transforms into a bulky tank, which is a good change borrowed from the Generation 2 design in the early 90s. Lastly, they decided to mesh two of his color palettes. His Generation 1 incarnation consisted of silver and red, and his more contemporary iterations consist of darker grays and purples. All of these things combined create an easily identifiable character that fans of nearly any iteration can easily recognize. So yeah, the art style is pretty damn great, and knowing that we'll never get to see more stories within this world is just saddening. So in conclusion, the single player is great fun. It's very clear that these developers have a love for the Transformers mythology, especially the Generation 1 era. So if you're a fan of old Transformers, or if you just want to hear more stories set in this awesome universe, you'll enjoy the single player. Oh, but wait, there's more. Well, at least there used to be. War for Cybertron came with a multiplayer mode, and while most multiplayer add-ons were alright, this game had something a little special. Unfortunately, with the servers being dead, and with a limited number of hours actually put into the multiplayer, I can only give my surface level knowledge. From what I remember, the gameplay was a lot of fun, but it was plagued with a few problems, mostly having to do with a game being this old. The PC controls were a little finicky in online matches, and the game was populated by high-level veterans who were just there to wreck newbies, such as myself. But what was there was great fun, and I even managed to play some escalation with a couple of randos in the community. It's a shame it's all gone now. So, that was War for Cybertron. An interesting title that was filled with love and nerdy care. You can tell that these guys had a love for Transformers, and rather than butcher the lore in the franchise, they decided to help improve it. The story was well written, the game had a nice flow, the combat loop is great fun, it's just a great game. Even if you can't play the game on co-op, the single player is still worthy of a try. Well, I guess that's it. Oh wait, they made a sequel. Oh that's right, they made another sequel. So we're actually going to take a look at both of them. Now I was a little hesitant on talking about either of these sequels, but I do have a few things to say. So to preface this, time for my genuine thoughts on Fall of Cybertron. Fall of Cybertron, released in 2012, was the sequel that fans had been clamoring for. High Moon Studios had refined their craft and the hype was intense. I don't remember much attention for the first game, but Fall of Cybertron actually felt like an event, at least among the smallish community that had grown around it. And like all events, it was kind of overhyped. The hype lasted for a while too. A ton of newer gamers praising the game as infinitely better than War for Cybertron. Oh, how superior it was in every way. And while I do agree that Fall of Cybertron did a lot of stuff right, it also took a couple of missteps. Luckily, with the help of hindsight, it's a lot easier to analyze what exactly Fall of Cybertron did well, and what it did poorly. First, the story. The story, in my opinion, isn't as good as the first game. Again, if you want to avoid spoilers, skip to here. The game opens with a flash forward to the end of the game, a la Metro 2033 style, before taking us back to the ending of the War for Cybertron. The Autobots are loading up their arc and get attacked by Decepticons. Optimus Prime activates Metroplex, an ancient giant Autobot, and after he destroys Megatron, the Decepticons retreat, with Starscream in command. Meanwhile, Jazz and Cliffjumper are sent to the Sea of Rust to locate Grimlock and his team. Instead, they find an enormous tower being operated by Shockwave as a space bridge. After fighting him, Shockwave escapes and the tower gets destroyed. The Autobots then try to take Energon back from the tower, but Starscream and the Combaticons attack the transport. Starscream tells the Combaticons to retreat, but they don't, and instead they take the ship down in a last-ditch effort, losing half of the Energon. They get arrested by Starscream for insubordination. Elsewhere, Megatron is revived by Soundwave in a new superior body. He fights Starscream's soldiers, and in a similar scene like the animated movie, we have a moment where a reborn, different-looking Megatron transforms into a cannon and shoots at Starscream, while Starscream's wearing some sort of crown. Although here, Starscream manages to escape. Out of spite, Starscream sneaks into Shockwave's base and sabotages his equipment. However, he discovers the Autobot Grimlock, modified by Shockwave for experimentation. He tries to make a deal with the Autobot, but Grimlock is not pleased and uses Starscream for his own escape. He scours across Shockwave's facility looking for his teammates, slowly discovering the abominations and creations that Shockwave has made. Insecticons and, more interestingly, Dinobots. Grimlock and his team have been modified to transform into animalistic designs based off of creatures from a primitive planet discovered in the space bridge. The Dinobots fight their way across the facility before they discover a rebuilt space bridge. Grimlock goes off and encounters Shockwave, to which he rips his arm off and blows up the tower, supposedly killing both of them. Meanwhile, the Autobots have very little time to actually make it through the now decreasing portal. Metroplex sacrifices himself to provide just enough energon for the Ark, allowing the last Autobots on Cybertron to finally flee the planet. In orbit, Megatron catches up to them through the use of a ship modified from the corpse of Trypticon. Megatron and Optimus finally duke it out, only to have both ships lose control and fly into the portal, leaving Cybertron behind. I remember playing the game for the first time and being a little disappointed with the story. I honestly wanted a little more content. I wanted larger battles. I wanted scenes where Optimus and Grimlock interacted with each other. I wanted some sort of natural escalation too, very similar to the first game. Since then, I have begun to appreciate the story over the years, with its nice world building of Cybertron's history. However, this doesn't feel like the conclusion that it was supposed to be. It would have been nice to see a lot more large-scale battles, as instead we only get them at the beginning and end of the game, one battle being reused. On top of that, a messy cliffhanger that would never be resolved. It felt a little disappointing, like it was way too small scale for the conclusion to Cybertron's existence. It felt like just a bunch of B stories with no real main plot or structure to hold them all together. I don't know, I guess it's just me. That being said, the presentation is still very good. Voice acting is great, character designs are perfect, and everything still looks nice. There is a ton of good stuff here, although you can't shake off some of its missteps. So let's take a look at what I liked and what I didn't. First, the art style. It took a major improvement. I attribute this mostly to the fact that High Moon actually put color in the game. Unfortunately, I don't feel like it was used to its full potential. I hate to sound like a cynic here, but a lot of the level aesthetics are kind of bland. You either have large open barren landscapes or generic corridors. The world also lacks the interesting mood that was set in the previous game, and you can tell just by looking at different levels. For example, Kaon, the Decepticon city. In War for Cybertron, this area looked much more menacing. The rain, the sinister architecture, just everything about it had a nice atmosphere. But in Fall of Cybertron, it's just nighttime. But still, the environments are nice and colorful, and it looks pretty good. The gameplay itself took a step forward and another step back. So what do I like? Well, the controls, they're pretty damn great. They feel a lot tighter and more responsive. Controlling vehicles no longer feels like a hassle on keyboard and mouse. Also, you can run over enemies, thank God. There are more weapons too, some with just straight up crazy abilities, plus new types of special transformers, like Combiners and Dinobots. Good stuff all around. But what do I not like? Well, the scriptedness of the entire experience. There's no co-op, and there's also no way to choose your character before the level. Also, I hope you like QuickTime events and button prompts, because we got them. This game keeps you on a track the entire way through. Now, I'm not saying that the game is easy. In fact, it can be quite challenging at times. However, you lose that sense of strategy and openness that was available in War for Cybertron. While yes, the levels in the first game were a bit linear, they weren't overly scripted. You were able to progress at your own pace, make your own decisions, decide how you wanted to approach an obstacle, and with co-op that made it even better. For example, I like this one section. How can we defend Ratchet? Well, they give you this whole room to decide your own options. So immediately you have to think of a strategy. Well, let's keep Warpath right next to Ratchet. I mean, he's got a shield. Optimus can probably be supporting us from above, maybe with one of the turrets. And Ironhide should be flanking from behind the Decepticons just to split up their fire. In this one area, you're given a ton of opportunities just to figure out how to survive combat, and I love that. But here, it just feels a little restrictive, and it loses the basic amount of replayability that the first game had. I feel like I'm ranting about Fall of Cybertron because I'm not trying to. It's a good game overall, and it's still a ton of fun to play. At first. But replaying it, I lost a lot of my enjoyment very fast. Still, for a first time experience, the campaign is pretty good. However, before I move on to the multiplayer, I need to discuss the weapon systems. Fall of Cybertron completely gutted the way weapons are handled and added in this Teletran bullshit. I'm sorry guys, this is what almost ruined the game for me. So now you have to buy your own weapons? What? But I know what you're thinking. Hey, upgrades. Any gun on the fly. What's so bad about this, Andy? Well, I'll tell you what's wrong. In War for Cybertron, weapons were obtained by picking them up off the floor. Certain transformers were locked to certain weapons, but otherwise you could wield any weapon any way you wanted. In a way, this felt quite liberating. Hey, do you want to wield a double-barrel shotgun in one hand and a semi-automatic shotgun in the other? Hell yeah, you can do so. Or hey, a grenade launcher and rocket launcher? Why the fuck not? Yeah, it may sound impractical, but that's your decision, not the game's. The simple idea that I have this amount of freedom is kind of nice. But here, not only do you need to purchase weapons if you want to actually use them, but each slot is limited to only certain kinds of weapons, meaning that there are some weapons that you can hold in slot 1, and some weapons that can be held in slot 2. So if there are 2 weapons that you love, but they happen to be in the same slot, too fucking bad, sucks to be you. Also, some of the guns are taken from the first game too. So when I was trying to use my old loadout, it wouldn't work. It was kinda sad not being able to stick to my usual guns. Instead, I had to stick with one gun that I used most of the time, and one I barely used. But this Teletran system also immediately broke my immersion on my first playthrough. Wait, what the fuck is this? Community rating? What? Is everyone on Cybertron all part of this social network group? What is this shit? Why even add this in at all? In the first game, you picked up a gun and that was it. Here you have to log into Facebook, access your Amazon deliveries, 1 star, not enough fucking barrels. I find it odd how such a seemingly insignificant inclusion can affect the entire game. I no longer feel like I'm fighting in a war. Instead, I feel like I'm playing an arcade game with money and loot. So let's then talk about the multiplayer. My experience was brief but pretty damn fun. The multiplayer felt a bit more refined than the previous title, and the controls, like in the single player, felt a lot more responsive. I had a blast playing with the different classes, messing around a bit with customization, and killing people as the Titan using a corrosive slime cannon. Although one complaint that I did have, and this may have just been because I was replaying it years after release, but lag seemed to be horrible. It would make matches just unplayable, and I wasn't entirely sure what this was. But aside from that, there isn't much I can talk about. Fun multiplayer, but too bad it's no longer around. So that was Fall of Cybertron, the conclusion to the small War for Cybertron franchise. While both games had their problems, they were fun experiences overall, and all things considered, it makes a nice, quaint little series. Oh wait. Oh no. Oh no. No! I gave my genuine thoughts on Fall of Cybertron. Now it's time for me to throw some shit at Rise of the Darkspark. The time between Fall of Cybertron and Rise of the Darkspark would prove to be the hardest time for High Moon Studios. In the summer of 2013, they would release their next licensed game, Deadpool. But unlike their Transformers series, Deadpool flopped spectacularly, and it resulted in Activision firing about 40 or so longtime employees. Since Deadpool, High Moon has been relegated to being one of the many countless other slave studios, as I like to call them, which has since become a trademark of Activision's business model. Slave studios don't make their own games or titles, but instead they simply help out background work on additional tasks for much other larger games, like Call of Duty and Destiny. But Activision was by no means done with the series, so they turned to Edge of Reality, another Activision-owned studio. The story of Edge of Reality is just as tragic as High Moon Studios. They were another shovelware studio, however they had a brief touch with their own freedom, with the multiplayer game Loadout. Damn, I still remember that game. That was their attempt at breaking out of Activision's claws and to pursue their own vision and ideas. But unfortunately, the game didn't turn out so hot, and in May of this year, its servers went offline. Another game killed. Right around the same time Loadout came out, they released Rise of the Darkspark, which is essentially a bastardization of both the game universe and the film universe. The plot is so stupid, I don't even want to explain it. Basically, Darkspark bad, Matrix of the leadership good, plot jumps between both the film and the game universe, and that's pretty much it. Where War for Cybertron felt like this huge expansive war, this game just feels like horrible fanfiction that should never have seen the light of day. It's an absolute pile of shit in more ways than one. First, any asset that isn't part of the film's universe is completely reused from Fall of Cybertron. No exceptions. Models, weapons, even fucking levels. So right away you get the impression that this was not only a cash-in title, but also a budget title. Next, the entire premise is so evil and despicable that I can't even wrap my head around it. The idea of killing this one series so beloved by its fans, only to tie it in with a shitty movie series just to make an extra buck, is so soulless and diabolical that it actually seems kind of funny. To put things into perspective, imagine the Arkham series. That's a beloved franchise, right? It's got a great set of games within their own continuity. Now imagine if Warner Brothers made a sequel to Arkham Knight in which the game tried to tie in with the shitty movie Justice League. Imagine seeing jarring transitions between the beautiful Arkham universe's Gotham right into Zack Snyder's ugly Gotham. Half the assets have been reused from Arkham Knight and the combat itself remains the exact same, except sometimes you switch from Kevin Conroy Batman to Ben Affleck Batman with no connection between the two. But of course you can get away with this type of stuff with Transformers. No one cares about it. Hell, this game might have been the straw on the camel's back that turned Hasbro against Activision, and I'll get into that in just a second. So Rise of the Darkspark. Just avoid it. Avoid it like the fucking plague. Today, War for Cybertron remains a beloved classic by old and new fans alike, although it's easy to forget that this wasn't always the case. When it first came out, this game had some oddly polarizing reviews and opinions. Like all games, it was clear to see the divide in critics. Sadly, I kept myself from checking it out, mostly thanks to these negative and mediocre reviews. But upon closer inspection, these critics seemed to look so dumb and aimless. Seriously, why was no one actually upset about this stuff? Like, fucking look at this. From a guy who took 15 hours to complete a 9-hour game, to a critic who's complaining about the very concepts of ammunition and limited health. It's a shame to see that these people once dictated the industry. This game doesn't have as much attention as it deserves. It's a wonderful title that I initially thought would show its flaws under the curtain of nostalgia, but lo and behold, it's still a ton of fun, even 8 years later. The gameplay is fast, fluid, and fun, story is engaging, characters are memorable, and set pieces and levels have some great designs and art styles. So go out and buy War for Cybertron on Steam and have a great time. Oh wait, I forgot to tell you the secret. War for Cybertron and Fall of Cybertron were fucking erased off the face of the earth. As of December 2017, these two games, along with a whole plethora of other Transformer titles, were removed from Steam, GOG, and all other digital stores as well. I dug a bit deeper into why, and it's not really that exciting or controversial. Activision simply had a contract with Hasbro to sell the Transformers video games, and in December the contract ended. Man, it was right smack dab in the middle of winter sale too. The real weird thing is that normally big contracts like this tend to get renewed fairly quickly, especially with franchises and IPs as big as Transformers. So far, it's been 6 months since these games were pulled from the internet, and not a word has surfaced about them. While this incident is pretty tame in comparison to a lot of other executions of video games, this one still hits close to home. Normally when games get put down, it's titles that have been up for well over 5 or 10 years, although that in itself is fucking horrific. The most recent game that have gotten pulled from this was Transformers Devastation by Platinum Games, 2 fucking years after its release. That's right, all it takes now is for video games to reach the ripe old age of 2 before their execution. As terrifying as that is, the part that I was actually more concerned about was the gaming media's reaction. More specifically, its lack thereof. You would think that the removal of 4 Transformers games and 1 non-Transformers game might get the attention of at least anyone, but only a few articles were actually written about it. Only one actually bothering to do any research. And guess what? The ultimate attitude for killing 5 games was, who cares? Literally every article I found decided to downplay the issue by taking a potshot at Rise of the Darkspark. Also, these games weren't classics, so they may as well deserve the chair. Jesus Christ, I want to tear my fucking hair out. Angry yet? Well, this isn't a new move for Activision. They literally did the exact same thing 1 year earlier for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Spider-Man. As expected, not a single soul in sight. Luckily, I bought these games beforehand, so despite this, I decided to continue with the video. Until I struck another hurdle. I originally wasn't even sure if I was going to make this, period. To start off, the games were scrubbed, and as far as I can tell, none of the online portions even work. Remember when I said that I was only able to recollect information regarding the multiplayer? Well, that's because the community is all but dead, both in-game and in the forums. On top of that, when the games used to be back up for purchase, War for Cybertron ran at 30 FPS. Now, I'm sorry, but I have to go off on a tangent. But I think it's safe to say that 30 FPS is no longer acceptable. I'm sick and tired of developers who seem to think that 30 FPS is adequate behavior. Destiny 2 Hell, even Crackdown 3, a game that doesn't even look graphically impressive in the slightest, to be restricted to 30? Keep in mind, Wolfenstein 3D, the game that revolutionized first-person shooters in general, was able to run at 70 FPS when it first launched. In 1992. But nope, 30 FPS for 2018, babies. Keep buying, idiots. Personally, I'm glad we're entering an age where people are actually waking up to this kind of BS. For a long time, 60 FPS was treated as a luxury, and not the standard that it is today. But this was from the early 2000s, a mysterious and primitive time. In fact, that was around the same time when you got a lot of people who thought that the human eye couldn't see past 30. Hell, I'm pretty sure there are still wackos who believe this. Although, I do have a hunch. Maybe some humans really can't see past 30. Now, the human eye can see well past our reasonable range of monitor refresh rates. Apparently, fighter pilots have been proven to see above 200. But maybe there are some people who legitimately see 30, and just don't think anything of it. I've thought about this, and the more you put the pieces together, the more it actually makes sense. Maybe these developers aren't lying manipulative assholes, but instead they actually can't tell the difference between 30 and 60. Maybe restricting games to 30 just doesn't seem to make that much of a difference to them. That actually would explain the attitudes of a lot of studios. In fact, that could be why certain AAA games that get ported to the PC have horrible optimization. The developers literally cannot see the frames dropping from 60 down to 30, so to them it's not a problem. Just think about it, how would you know what frame rate your eyes were locked to? I guess you could maybe take one of those online tests that would show the difference between various frame rates. Still, if you weren't explicitly aware of this fact, you probably wouldn't even think anything of it. You'd see a 60 FPS game and not notice anything different. I don't know, I'm just spitballing here. But hopefully within this span of time, you've maybe clicked that little gear icon down here to verify that yes, this footage is recorded in 60 FPS. And that was thanks to an FPS unlocker made by a guy named Psych, which allowed the game to run well above 30. When I replayed this game, when it was still commercially available on Steam, this is how I achieved 60. I had to force VSync as leaving it uncapped led into some weird glitches. So when coming up with this video, I went back to War for Cybertron to relive some fun memories, and imagine my surprise, it didn't work. The program had completely broken, and it would just crash the game. I was not the only person experiencing this. Countless people all across the web kept reporting this problem. This one frame locker made by this single guy stopped working. The dude uploaded this EXE on June 29th in 2010. For reference, the game itself came out on June 22nd, just 1 week before. This guy's weird FPS tool is only 7 days younger than the game itself, so there was no chance of any sort of update from this guy. As far as we know, he's probably dead. And this is where I initially gave up. I scoured the internet looking for solutions and found none. I tried to find older versions of the game, still no luck. Compatibility, drivers, none of this stuff worked. However, it took a few months until another user, by the vague name of General Admission, to create his own FPS tool. And guess what? It worked. At least for a retail copy. It didn't work for my Steam copy, but I think that might have to do with the fact that the executable location is in a different hard drive. Of course, you new players won't need to worry about that, as the Steam version is no longer available. Secondhand retail copies are the only way to play this game anymore. So I'll provide a link to this tool. I'm sorry, but there are certain games where 30 FPS isn't that bad, but on fast-paced action games, it just gets nauseating. So that's my review on War for Cybertron. It's a great joyride all the way through, and is genuinely a personal favorite. On the surface, War for Cybertron seems to be nothing more than nostalgia-pandering shovelware, which is becoming more and more common these days. But upon closer inspection, you can find a lot of creativity and effort from the part of the developers. You can tell that High Moon Studios didn't just want to make a Gen 1 Transformers game, they wanted to show off an entire world. They had grand ideas that, while limited to a small single-player game, definitely shine through, even 8 years later. From intense and well-balanced gameplay to a beautiful art style to look at, War for Cybertron is great fun. So, that was the video. I hope you guys enjoyed this retrospective. If you would like to see more of these types of long-form reviews, please subscribe, I'd really appreciate it. See you everyone, this is Inspector Magnum, signing off.